The night my husband came home smelling like someone else's perfume, I said nothing. I poured his coffee. I smiled. I told myself I was imagining things. That was the night everything inside me went quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that comes right before something breaks. I was 8 months pregnant. I was living in a 7,000 square foot house that had his name on every wall, and almost none of mine left anywhere. I had given up my career, my best friend, my father. Everything Preston asked me to give up, I gave it. Because I thought that was what love required. I thought love required me to disappear. I was wrong. 3 days after that night, he grabbed my arm, in my own kitchen, with my unborn daughter still inside me. And I finally did the one thing he had spent 3 years making sure I would never do. I called my father. 2 hours later, 4 black SUVs pulled into that driveway, and the man who had made me feel small for 3 years rang his own doorbell. If you have ever stayed somewhere you should have left because you were afraid, because you were told you were overreacting, because you stopped trusting yourself, this story was made for you. Stay with me. Because the most important part isn't how it fell apart. It's what I found when I finally stopped holding it together. If this story speaks to you, hit like, drop a comment below, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Every share brings this to someone who might need it today.
The clock on the hallway wall read 11:43. Maggie Harlow stood very still, one hand pressed flat against the wall. The other held a glass of water she had poured 15 minutes ago and hadn't touched. She was listening. Down the hall, the study door was closed. The light glowed underneath it, a thin yellow line against dark hardwood. Preston had come home 2 hours late. He had walked past the kitchen without speaking, past the dinner she had kept warm, past her, straight to the study. She told herself it was work stress. She told herself that a lot lately. She took one step toward the door. The floor didn't creak here. She knew every creak in this house, 7,000 square feet, and she had memorized all of it. 3 years gave you time to learn things like that. Through the door, silence, then a laugh. Low, soft, not his boardroom laugh, which was large and performed and meant for rooms full of people. This was something else, something smaller and warmer, something she had never heard from him before, and that was its own kind of cold. She told herself it was a business call. She went back to bed. She lay in the dark, with both hands on her belly, 8 months along. The baby shifted under her palms, a slow, rolling movement, like the baby was turning over in sleep. She stared at the ceiling. I've been telling myself things for a long time, she thought. She didn't know exactly when she started doing that. Telling herself things, small reassurances she hadn't asked for, little explanations she constructed before the questions had fully formed. It's just work stress. He's under pressure. He doesn't mean it the way it sounds. 3 years of small explanations. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep for a long time. The next morning was ordinary in every visible way. Coffee brewing, the smell of it filling the kitchen. Preston's tie draped over the back of his chair. Charcoal gray, silk, the one she had given him 2 Christmases ago. His phone face down on the counter, which it always was, which she had never thought about until this exact Tuesday morning, standing at the kitchen island with her maternity dress pulling across her ribs and the baby pressing down on her bladder. He reached for the phone. He saw her looking at it. He turned it face up. Just a phone, just a counter, just a Tuesday, but something tightened in her chest. She poured his coffee. He took it without looking at her. Cedar. His cologne was cedar. Always had been. She had bought him the same bottle every birthday for 3 years. Cedar and something dark and clean. That was the smell of Preston Harlow. But underneath it this morning, something else. Floral, sweet. Light in a way his cologne was not. Not her perfume, not any candle in this house. Not any soap they owned. She knew that smell. She couldn't place it, but she knew it didn't belong here. She said nothing. He left. She stood at the kitchen island, and the coffee went cold in her cup, and the baby kicked once, hard, and she picked up her phone. She put it down. She picked it up again. She put it down. She went to water her houseplants instead. She always watered the plants when she didn't know what to do with her hands. She checked her phone 3 times before 8 in the morning. Lock, unlock, lock. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. A message from a number she didn't recognize. An explanation that would appear out of nowhere. Something that would make everything make sense and ruin everything at the same time. Nothing. She slid the phone into her pocket and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard. The garden she had planted in the first year of their marriage, when she had believed that this house could become hers. The roses were coming up. Real roses, not the name she had already chosen for the baby. Just flowers doing what flowers did, not knowing what was happening inside the house they grew beside. She thought about her design studio, the one she had closed 14 months ago. Small studio, 3 regular clients. She had designed logos, brand identities, packaging for small businesses that couldn't afford the big agencies. A coffee shop, and Bexley had asked her for a logo, and she had drawn them a sparrow, holding a coffee cup, and the owner had cried when she saw it. Said it was exactly right. Maggie had felt exactly right. Preston had said, "You don't need to work anymore." He had said, "Why spend your energy on other people's brands when you could be building our family?" He had said, "You'll have more time with the baby." She had agreed. She had put her design software to sleep and put her sketchbooks in the guest room closet, and she had agreed. It had felt like being loved. Now she stood at the kitchen window and thought about the sparrow, and thought about the closet, and thought about the smell of something floral that was not hers on her husband's collar. She found the dry cleaning ticket at 9:15. She was reorganizing the kitchen. Her hands always needed something, and she went through the pockets of his jacket where it hung on the hook by the door. Force of habit. She was always finding things in his pockets. Receipts, coins, folded notes from meetings. The ticket was from 3 weeks ago, his name, an address that was not their house. She called the dry cleaner. They had a shirt, one shirt, ready for pickup for 3 weeks. She hadn't dropped it off. Someone had, using Preston's name, at an address she didn't recognize. She said, "Thank you." She hung up. She sat down on the kitchen floor because standing felt like too much. The baby pressed against her ribs. The dry cleaning ticket was in her hand. The floral smell from this morning was still in the back of her throat. "Okay," she thought. "Okay. She texted Preston. She kept it light. She always kept things light. "Found your dry cleaning ticket. The shirt's been ready for 3 weeks. What address did you use?" He responded in 4 minutes. Already formed. Already smooth. Wrong address by mistake. "I'll pick it up. Don't worry about it." 4 minutes was fast. The explanation was ready. Too ready. She took a screenshot. She didn't know why yet. Her fingers just did it before her brain caught up. She put the phone on the counter. She breathed. Maybe I'm reading into things. But then, she thought, and then, that's what I always think. And then, I am so tired of telling myself that. The baby kicked again. Firm and insistent. "I know," she thought. "I know." That evening, Ruth finished the upstairs cleaning and let herself out without a word. Ruth had worked for the Harlow family for years. She came 3 times a week. She was thorough and quiet, and she had stopped making eye contact with Maggie sometime around 6 months ago. Maggie had noticed. She had added it to the list of things she told herself small explanations about. She stood in the kitchen after Ruth left and looked at the house around her. 7,000 square feet, 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms. A study with a door that closed, A garden with roses that were coming in, a housekeeper who wouldn't meet her eyes, a husband who smelled like someone else's perfume, a baby who kicked when Maggie was afraid. She put her hand on the counter. She steadied herself. She thought, something is wrong, not a question, not a suspicion, a fact arriving quietly, the way facts sometimes did, just settling into place without ceremony. Something is wrong. She had known it for longer than this morning. She was only now letting herself know that she knew. Outside, a car turned onto their street. For 1 second, she thought it was Preston. It wasn't. It passed the house and continued down the road. She exhaled. She began making dinner. The dinner party was Thursday evening. Preston entertained often. He was very good at it. He became, at dinner parties, a person Maggie sometimes forgot was not real, warm, generous, funny in the way that made people lean forward. He refilled glasses before people asked. He remembered the names of children, the details of projects, the names of the dogs of people he had met only twice. He made everyone feel like the most interesting person in the room. She had always watched him do this with a mixture of admiration and something she had never let herself name. Tonight she named it envy. She was envious of the ease, because around her, in private, in their home, he was something else entirely. The guests were Preston's business associates, a developer named Leonard Crane and his wife Patrice. Patrice was the kind of woman who noticed things. She had touched Maggie's arm when she arrived and said the nursery must be almost ready, and her voice had been warm in a way that wasn't performative. Maggie had been grateful for that in a way that felt disproportionate. She hadn't been noticed in a long time. At the table, Preston told a story about a deal they had closed last month. It was a good story. He was a good storyteller. Everyone laughed in the right places. He put his hand over Maggie's on the table, warm, public, deliberate, and said to the table, "She's my anchor. I genuinely don't know what I'd do without her." Maggie smiled. Across the table, Patrice caught her eye. Something moved across Patrice's expression. Careful, reading something. Then she looked away and said something to her husband. Maggie looked down at her plate. He hasn't looked at me directly since Monday, she thought. Not once. He looks through me, past me, at the wall behind me. I'm furniture in my own marriage. Stop it. He just called you his anchor, in front of everyone. Right, in front of everyone. After the guests left, Preston poured himself a scotch. He was pleased. The dinner had gone well. He was relaxed in a way Maggie hadn't seen in weeks. This version of Preston, the pleased, relaxed version, was the only version she felt she could speak to without planning every word in advance. She asked about the shirt, lightly. She asked everything lightly. She had learned to ask everything lightly. He didn't tense. He just turned toward her with an expression she had seen many times, the one that made her feel like she was a small thing and he was a very tall building and she had been standing in its shadow so long she had forgotten how to be in the sun. He said, "I already told you it was a mistake." She said, "I know, I just wondered." He said, "Maggie." Just her name. The way he said just her name was a complete sentence. It meant, stop. We are done with this. You are being tedious. She stopped. He finished his scotch. He said the house had looked good tonight. That was a compliment. She took it. He went to bed. She stayed in the kitchen for 40 minutes, cleaning things that did not need cleaning. She wiped the counter 3 times, the same counter. She scrubbed a spot that wasn't there. She rearranged the glasses in the cabinet so the tallest were at the back, which was not how they had been before, which Preston would notice and quietly rearrange tomorrow morning. She knew that. She did it anyway. Control, she thought. When you can't control anything, you control the cabinets. She had been controlling the cabinets for 3 years. Friday morning, Dr. Avery Cole's office on Riverside. Routine check. Week 34. Blood pressure. Fetal position. The ordinary measurements of an ordinary pregnancy. Dr. Cole was efficient in the way that good doctors were, warm and precise at the same time. She was the kind of doctor who looked at you, and not just through you, who noticed things beyond what she was technically looking for. Today she was checking Maggie's blood pressure, and her gaze moved to Maggie's upper arm. A bruise, faded yellow-green, large, the distinct shape of a hand. Dr. Cole paused. She asked about it, neutrally, professionally. Not the first time she had needed to ask this particular question. Maggie said she had walked into a door frame. She said it without thinking. It came out smooth and practiced because it was. Dr. Cole wrote something. Then she slid a card across the desk. A plain white card, a phone number, a resource. She said, "You don't have to do anything with that. I just want you to have it." Maggie took the card. She put it in her wallet. She did not look at it, but she did not throw it away. She sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes after the appointment. She could not make herself drive yet. She thought about calling Diane Sutton, her best friend from college, her person for 10 years until Preston had quietly and methodically explained why Diane was not good for Maggie. "Diane is negative," he had said. "She always leaves you in a bad mood." He had said, "She doesn't understand the life we're building." And Maggie had agreed. She had pulled back from Diane slowly. Calls became texts, became occasional likes on social media, became silence. It had felt like growing up, choosing her marriage, being mature. Now she sat in a parking lot with Dr. Cole's card in her wallet and 34 weeks of pregnancy pressing against her seatbelt. And she thought, when did I stop calling my best friend? She didn't call Diane. She drove home, but she thought about it the whole way. The whole way. Ruth was cleaning the upstairs when she got home. Preston was at the office. Maggie set her keys on the counter. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she walked down the hall to the study. She was not a person who went through her husband's things. She had never done this. She had a principle about it. Privacy mattered. Trust mattered. She stood in front of his desk for a long time. Then she opened the top drawer. Receipts, a folder with project notes, a flash drive she didn't recognize. And underneath the folder, pushed to the back, a photograph, printed on plain paper, not professional, candid, a woman, outdoors somewhere, laughing at something outside the frame. Young, pretty, genuinely happy in the way people looked when they didn't know they were being photographed. Not Maggie. She looked at the photograph for a long time, then she put it back exactly where she had found it. Drawer closed, everything in its place. She walked out of the study, through the kitchen, out the back door. She sat down on the garden bench and put both hands on her belly and did not move for 20 minutes. I knew, she thought, not with anger yet, just with a terrible, settling clarity. I knew from the beginning. I have known for a long time. I have been knowing and not knowing at the same time for longer than I want to count. The roses were nearly open. She sat with her hands on her belly, and she let herself know. She didn't confront him. Not yet. This needed to be understood clearly, because it was the part of the story that people on the outside never quite got right. The part where someone looked at a woman like Maggie and said, "But why didn't you just..." She didn't confront him because she had been trained. Not all at once. Slowly. Over 3 years of small corrections. "You're overthinking this," said so gently, said so reasonably. "You always do this. You get an idea in your head, and you spiral," said while touching her hand, said while looking at her with what appeared to be genuine concern. "I worry about you sometimes," said while refilling her wine glass, said while being the warmest version of himself. 3 years of corrections until she had stopped trusting the thing inside her that said, wait, something is not right. 3 years until that inner voice had become so small she could almost miss it. Almost. She sat in the garden that afternoon and she thought about her father, Robert Whitfield, 61 years old, commercial real estate attorney, a man she had not spoken to in 2 years. She hadn't planned not to speak to him. It had happened like everything else had happened, gradually, with explanation. In the second year of their marriage, Preston had come home from a charity dinner and mentioned that Robert Whitfield had been there. He had said it flatly. I didn't realize he ran in these circles. Something in his voice. Not quite anger, not quite disapproval, calculation. Over the weeks that followed, Preston had assembled a case. He had done it carefully, patiently. He had found things her father had genuinely done wrong. There were things, real things, from her childhood, moments where Robert Whitfield had been absent or self-involved in ways that had hurt her. Maggie had always had complicated feelings about her father. Preston had found those feelings, and he had excavated them, examined them, exaggerated them. And Maggie, who had already struggled with those feelings, who had a real history of hurt where her father was concerned, who was predisposed to believe a story that confirmed old wounds, had agreed with him. She had called her father and said, I need some space. He had said, Maggie, whatever I've done, please don't. She had said, I'll call you when I'm ready. She hadn't called. Now, sitting in the garden, 8 months pregnant, she asked herself a question she had never asked before. What exactly did my father do that was so unforgivable? Because I can't remember anymore. I just remember Preston telling me it was unforgivable. I remember his face when he explained it to me. I remember the tone of his voice. But the actual thing my father did, I can't find it when I reach for it. She sat with that for a long time. I lost myself, she thought. Not a question, a statement arriving with quiet force. I didn't just lose pieces. I handed them over, one at a time. Every time I said, you're right, when I knew he wasn't. Every time I agreed to keep the peace. Every time I closed a drawer I should have opened. I lost myself trying to keep him. She called Diane. She sat on the garden bench, and she found the number, and she pressed call before she could talk herself out of it. Diane answered on the second ring. Maggie, she said. Just the name, but with everything in it. 6 weeks of unanswered texts, and before that, a year of thin, careful conversations, and before that, 3 years of distance Maggie had imposed without fully understanding why. Maggie said, I found a photo in his desk. Diane said, okay, tell me everything. And Maggie did. For the first time in 3 years, she told someone the truth without softening it first, without the careful edits, without the small adjustments she made to protect Preston's image, to protect her own image, to protect the version of her marriage that she needed other people to believe in. She told Diane about the photograph, the dry cleaning ticket, the address she didn't recognize, the bruise on her arm that she had explained as a door frame, the way Ruth would not meet her eyes, the laugh she had heard through the study door at 11:43 on a Tuesday night. Diane listened. She didn't make sounds of outrage or dramatic sympathy. She just said, in the right places, and keep going and let Maggie talk. When Maggie was done, Diane said, how are you physically? Are you safe right now? The word safe did something to Maggie's chest, something unexpected, a small collapse behind her sternum. Because she had never asked herself that question. She had asked herself if she was right, if she was being reasonable, if she was overreacting, if she was the problem. She had asked herself every version of every question except the simplest one. Am I safe? She said, I'm fine. Diane said, Maggie, Gently, the way Diane said her name was different from the way Preston said it. Preston's version was a full stop. Diane's was a door left open. Maggie said, "There was a bruise last month on my arm." 4 seconds of silence on the line. Then Diane said, "I'm coming." Maggie said, "You don't have to." Diane said, "I'm not asking." After she hung up, she sat for a while longer. She thought about the design portfolio she had not updated in 3 years, the software sleeping on a laptop in the guest room closet, the sketchbooks on the shelf under the laptop, the sparrow she had drawn for the coffee shop in Bexley. She had felt exactly right that day. Sitting at her studio table, drawing that sparrow, knowing she had gotten it. The rightness of a thing when it was finally the thing it was supposed to be. She went inside. She went to the guest room. She opened the closet. The laptop was there. The sketchbooks were there. Everything exactly where she had left it. Undisturbed in 14 months. She took the top sketchbook down. She sat on the closet floor. She couldn't have explained why the closet felt safer than any room in the house, but it did. And she opened the sketchbook to a blank page. She picked up a pen from the shelf. She held it over the blank page. She didn't draw. Not yet. She wasn't ready yet. But she held the pen. That was something. That was a beginning. Preston came home early the next day. 4 in the afternoon. He had Thai food, her favorite. He hadn't brought her favorite in months. He called her name with warmth in his voice. When he set it on the counter, she came in from the garden with the sketchbook in her hand. He saw it. Something crossed his face, fast, gone in an instant. And then the warmth was back. He said, "Getting creative again?" She said, "I found a photograph in your desk." She said it before she had decided to. It came out flat. No emphasis, just a statement. The kitchen changed. His face didn't crumble. It didn't blaze into anger. It became very still, a particular kind of stillness she recognized. The stillness before a calculated response. He said, "What were you doing in my desk?" Not, "What photograph?" Not, "I can explain." Straight to her transgression, her violation of his privacy. She noticed that. Filed it. She said, "Who is she?" He said, "An architect on the Westfield project." "You went through my desk." She said, "Why do you have her picture?" He said, "Maggie, stop sign, full stop." She did not stop. She said, "Why do you have her picture, Preston?" He crossed the kitchen. He took the sketchbook from her hand, gently, without asking. He set it on the counter and looked at her. He said, "You are 8 months pregnant and extremely hormonal, and I am genuinely worried about you." She said, "Don't do that." He said, "Do what?" She said, "Make this about my hormones." He said, "I'm not making anything about anything. I am concerned about you." So reasonable. Always so reasonable. The words were concern and care and worry, and they landed like a fog, like they always did. The certainty she had walked into this kitchen with began to blur at the edges. Am I wrong? Am I wrong? Maybe I'm wrong. But this time something was different. Underneath the fog, something solid. Small, but solid. She had the screenshot. She had Dr. Cole's card. She had called Diane. She nodded. She said, "Okay." He kissed her forehead. He said, "Let's eat before it gets cold." They ate in near silence. She did not touch the sketchbook again that evening, but she knew exactly where it was. 3 days passed in the worst possible way. Not explosive, not openly hostile, just pressurized, like the air in a room where a window has been sealed shut. Preston was attentive. He came home on time. He asked how she was feeling. He asked about her appointments. He offered to come to her next OB visit, which he had never done in 8 months of pregnancy, which she did not want and could not find a reasonable objection to. She said she was fine. She could manage. He nodded and said he just wanted to be there for her. He said it sincerely. He was very good at sincerity. Diane called twice. Maggie answered in a low voice, said she was fine, said she'd call back. She didn't call back. She told herself she needed more information before she did anything. She told herself she was being careful. Really, she was afraid. Not of Preston exactly, afraid of the moment she stopped being able to pretend she didn't know. She found Claire Novak's name on a Wednesday morning. No writing on the photograph. But there was a building in the background, a specific building. She recognized the Westfield site. He had mentioned it to her once. She found the project online, the architectural firm, their team page, Claire Novak, 28 years old, associate architect. Her professional headshot, smiling, was the same face. Maggie sat at her laptop in the guest room for a long time. She had expected rage. She had imagined many times, in the half-conscious way you imagine things you didn't want to think about, that if she ever confirmed what she suspected, she would feel something huge and destructive, something that burned. She didn't feel that. She felt the last piece of a picture she already knew was ugly slide into place. The quiet, terrible relief of knowing for certain what you have known in your body for months. Of course, she thought. Of course. It's so ordinary. It's exactly what it looks like. I knew. I always knew. She closed the laptop. She called her mother. Carol Whitfield answered with warmth and immediate worry. She always heard something in Maggie's voice before Maggie said anything. Mother's instinct, she called it. Maggie told her, trying to be calm. Her voice broke on photograph and again on architect, and again when she said, Mom, I think it's been going on for a long time. Carol was quiet. Then she said, and Maggie knew her mother meant well, knew her mother loved her with everything she had, knew her mother had no idea the weight of what she was about to say. Carol said, Sweetheart, you're so close to your due date. Are you sure this is the right time? Maybe wait until after the baby and you're feeling more settled. Maggie said, I'm not unsettled, Mom. Carol said, I know. I just mean emotionally. Maggie said, he has someone else. There is a bruise on my arm from where he grabbed me, and you're asking me to wait. Silence. Then Carol quietly, a bruise? Yes, a bruise, another silence. Then, oh, Maggie. 2 words. They opened something. Maggie cried for the first time. Sitting at the desk in the guest room, laptop closed, Claire Novak's headshot burned into the inside of her eyes, and her mother said nothing, just stayed on the line, breathing steadily. It was not enough. But it was something. It was someone staying. After she hung up, she drew a bath. She drew it too hot, adjusted the temperature, lowered herself in with the graceless labor of getting into a tub at 34 weeks pregnant. One hand on the wall, one on the rim, easing down in stages. She lay back. She stared at the ceiling. The bathroom was hers, entirely hers. Preston never came in here. She had chosen the pale green tile, the color of new leaves in early April, and the deep soaking tub and the wooden shelf by the window where her books lived. She had chosen all of it, and it was the only room in this house where she still felt like someone with preferences. She looked at the book spines now. She could name the year she had bought each one. The Stegner from her last year of college, the Ann Tyler from the summer she and Diane had driven to New England, the poetry collection from the gallery, opening where she had met Preston. She didn't think about Preston. She didn't think about Claire Novak. She rested her hands on the curve of her belly, under the water, and she thought about the baby. Her name is Rose, she thought. Not a question, not a I think, maybe, or a what do you think about? Just a fact. Her name is Rose. I've always known her name was Rose. Every name Preston suggested felt like it belonged to his family, not to her, not to me. Her name is Rose. She stayed in the tub until the water went cold. He came home smelling of it again. Cedar and the flowers that weren't hers. That same sweetness she had first noticed on a Tuesday morning. She hadn't planned to confront him. She hadn't been ready. But he walked into the kitchen and the smell walked in with him, and something in her was simply done. Done pretending she didn't notice. Done protecting his comfort at the expense of her own reality. She said, "I know her name, Claire Novak." "How long?" He turned from the counter slowly, very still. He said, "What did you say?" She said, "How long has it been going on?" He crossed the kitchen, 3 steps. He was very tall. She was 8 months pregnant. She was aware of exactly how much space she occupied, and how much harder it was to move quickly, and how much larger he seemed when he moved toward her with that particular expression. He said, "You've been looking into my business. You went through my desk. You've been calling people behind my back." She said, "I'm calling people because you are cheating on me." He grabbed her arm, the same place as before. This time it wasn't a grab. His hand closed around her arm and twisted, and she gasped and stumbled back against the counter, and the water glass on the edge fell and shattered on the floor, and the sound of it was enormous. And then the room was very, very quiet. He let go. He stepped back. They both looked at the broken glass on the floor. Her arm was trembling. The baby was completely still. The silence in the kitchen was the loudest thing she had ever heard. She said, very quietly, "Get out of my house," he said. "Your house," she said. "Get out." He picked up his keys from the counter. Carefully, around the glass, he walked out. The front door closed. Not a slam, a quiet click, which was somehow worse than anything else. She stood against this counter and could not step away because the glass was everywhere, and she was barefoot and could not reach down to clean it up. She stood there for a long time, just standing, just breathing. The baby moved. Once. A single, definitive kick. "I know," she thought. "I know." At 2 in the morning, she lay in the guest room and scrolled through her phone. She opened her text thread with Preston. She opened her thread with Diane. She opened her contacts and scrolled until she found a number she had looked at maybe 100 times in 2 years without pressing call. "Dad." She stared at it. She texted Diane instead. "He grabbed me. I'm okay." He left. Diane responded in 40 seconds. "I'm coming tonight." Maggie typed, "It's 2 in the morning." Diane typed, "I don't care." Maggie typed, "Not tonight, but I need help." Diane typed, "Whatever you need, tell me." Maggie typed, "I need to know what to do." Diane typed, "I know a lawyer." Maggie set the phone on the pillow beside her. She lay on her side with her hands on her belly. "I'm not crazy," she thought. "I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I know the shape of his hand on my arm, and I know the look on his face when he stepped back. Not guilt. Not horror at what he'd done. Calculation. He was calculating what it meant. My daughter is not going to grow up watching me disappear. Her name is Rose. Her name is Rose, and we are going to be okay." Preston came back at 8 in the morning. Different clothes, which meant he had been somewhere overnight, which she did not ask about. He sat at the kitchen table. He was in the quiet, self-recriminating version of himself. She had seen this version before. It always followed the other version. It was part of the pattern, though she had not called it a pattern until Diane had used that word on the phone. A pattern, not a bad month. A pattern. He said, "I don't know what happened last night." He said, "I'm under so much pressure." He said, "I would never," and stopped. Couldn't finish the sentence because the sentence was false and some part of him knew it. He said, I need help. She poured him coffee. Her hands were steady. She didn't know when they had become steady. At some point in the night, the shaking had stopped and something else had replaced it. She said, I know. He said, can we talk about this rationally? She said, I think so. Not today. He said, I love you. She said nothing. Not because she was frozen. Because she was done, filling his silences to make him comfortable. He looked at her for a long moment, then he finished his coffee and said he had to go to the office. He would be home by 6. They would talk. She nodded. He left. She poured his unfinished coffee down the drain. Diane arrived at 11 in the morning. She had driven 4 hours from Cincinnati. She pulled up in her gray Honda with a bag that suggested she planned to stay and an expression that suggested she had been preparing this visit in her mind for approximately 2 years. She got out of the car and hugged Maggie. Long, full, the way women who loved each other hugged when words hadn't caught up yet. She said, you look tired. Maggie said, I am tired. Diane said, good news. You are fully allowed to be tired. You're also allowed to eat this entire pan of brownies I made at 6 this morning because I couldn't sleep. They ate brownies at the kitchen table. Diane looked around the kitchen the way a person looked at a place they had opinions about, and she did not share a single one of those opinions. That restraint, Maggie knew, was a kind of love. Then Diane set down her brownie and said, tell me everything, all of it, not just last night. Maggie told her, all of it. The studio she had given up, the friends who had gradually fallen away, her father, the slow erasure of that relationship, how Preston had found the real wounds and made them larger, the dry cleaning ticket, the photograph, Claire Novak's headshot on the architectural firm's website, the years of being told she was too sensitive, too dramatic, too much, the years of slowly, incrementally believing it. Diane listened. Her expression became very careful and still. When Maggie finished, Diane said, what he did to you, the isolation, the controlling, the bruise, the grab last night, that's a pattern. That is a documented pattern of domestic abuse. That is not a rough patch. That is not a marriage going through a hard time. That is a pattern. Maggie said, I know. Diane said, do you? Because you're telling me this like it was a series of misunderstandings. Maggie was quiet. Then she said, I think I'm only just now letting myself call it what it is. Diane said, call it, not a demand. Permission. A door opened. Maggie said, he abused me. Her voice broke on the last word, not because she didn't believe it, because saying it out loud made it real in a way that it hadn't been before. Real was very heavy. Real meant it had happened. Real meant she had been living inside it without naming it. Diane said, yes, he did. And you are 8 months pregnant, which means we are not waiting. The lawyer Diane knew was Thomas Keene, family law, 20 years of practice. Diane called him on speaker at the kitchen table. His voice was measured and warm without being falsely bright. The voice of someone who had answered this particular kind of call many times and never became casual about it. He asked questions. Maggie answered them. He said, I want to start the protection order process today. Documented bruising and a witnessed escalation give us grounds. I also want you thinking about where you'll stay. Maggie said, this is my house too. He said, you're right. We can pursue emergency exclusive possession, but it takes time. For the immediate period, is there somewhere safe? She thought about her mother, 2.5 hours away, who had told her to wait, who loved her and was also not ready for this. She thought about Diane's apartment in Cincinnati. No nursery, not close to Dr. Cole. She thought about the number she hadn't called. She said, I need to make a one call first. Can I call you back in an hour? Thomas said, Of course, but Maggie, don't take too long. These windows. She said, I understand. 1 hour? She went to the garden. She sat on the bench where she had sat the morning after the dry cleaning ticket. The roses were fully open now, pink and cream, slightly reckless, leaning into the warm afternoon. She took her phone out. She found the number, Dad. She had looked at it so many times. Never pressed it. She pressed it. 3 rings, 4, then Maggie. Her father's voice. Her name in his voice. Not surprised. Or if surprised, moving past it instantly, prioritizing what mattered, which was that she had called. She said, Dad, I'm in trouble. He said, Tell me where you are. She said, I'm at the Harlow house. But Dad, I need to say something first. I was wrong to... Preston told me things about you and I... He said, Maggie, we will talk about all of that. I want to hear all of it. But right now, tell me what kind of trouble. She told him. There was a silence on the line. Not the silence of a man who didn't know what to do. The silence of a man deciding very quickly and very precisely what he was about to do. He said, Are you safe right now? She said, Yes, my friend is here. He left. He said, Is the baby okay? She said, Yes. He said, I'm sending someone. They'll be there in 2 hours. Do not be alone when they arrive. She said, Dad, he said, I've been waiting for you to call. I'm so glad you called. Before anything worse happened. She started to say something, couldn't. He said, I love you, Margaret. We're going to fix this. She sat on the bench after she hung up. The sun was moving. Somewhere down the street, someone was mowing their lawn. That low domestic drone, completely ordinary, completely at odds with the size of what was happening inside her. She put both hands on her belly. She said, out loud, quietly, Rose, we're going to be okay. The baby moved. She didn't cry. She just breathed. She just let the afternoon be an afternoon. 2 hours and 14 minutes later, the doorbell rang. She and Diane were in the living room. Maggie went to the door. On the driveway, 4 black SUVs. No flashing lights, no sirens, just 4 large, dark vehicles arranged with a precision that was itself a statement. The kind of vehicles that arrived when someone had already thought through every next step. The man who stepped out of the first one was in his early 50s, gray suit, a briefcase, a face that had seen a great many things and was not alarmed by any of them. He said, Mrs. Harlow, I'm Leonard Graves. I work with your father. He offered a card. We're here to help you. She looked at the cars. She looked at Leonard Graves. She said, That was fast. He said, Your father has been ready for 2 years. Something in her chest cracked open. Not pain. Something older than pain. The specific relief of realizing you were never as alone as you believed. That someone had been watching the door from the outside, waiting for you to open it. She stepped aside. She let them in. Leonard Graves was not dramatic about his work. He sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a laptop and Thomas Keene on speakerphone, and he asked questions in a methodical, unhurried way that was, in itself, a kind of steadiness. 2 of the SUVs had contained his associates. A paralegal, a licensed private investigator, 2 former law enforcement professionals who were staying outside because their presence in the house wasn't necessary, but their presence on the property was. Robert Whitfield was not in any of the cars. He was 2 states away finishing a meeting he could not immediately leave. But in the 2 hours since Maggie had called him, he had moved every resource he had toward his daughter with the precision of a man who had been planning exactly this for a long time. Leonard explained the legal framework, the protection order timeline, what documentation they had, and what they still needed. Then he said, "Your father has been aware, through mutual contacts in the industry, that your husband has been moving assets." "Not recently. Over the past 18 months, Maggie said. "What does that mean?" Leonard said. "It means he has been preparing to leave, while keeping you in the house. The apartment he has been maintaining downtown, that's been paid for 14 months, Diane said, from across the table. He was setting her up to have nothing. Leonard said simply, "Yes." Preston came back at 5 in the afternoon. He didn't know about the cars. He pulled into the driveway, and through the living room window, Maggie watched his face do something she had never seen it do before. It went small, not angry, not defensive, small, like a man encountering something much larger than himself and recalculating very quickly. He got out of his car. He looked at the SUVs. He looked at the house. He put his hand in his pocket. Then he walked to the front door and rang his own doorbell, which told her everything. He was announcing himself. He knew something had shifted. Leonard opened the door. Preston said, "Who are you?" Leonard said his name, said who he represented. Preston said, "This is my house." Leonard said, "Your wife would like you to speak with her attorney, Thomas Keene, before entering. Mr. Keene is currently on the phone." Preston looked past Leonard. He saw Maggie. She was standing in the entrance to the kitchen, both hands at her sides. She was looking at him. She watched his face, carefully, thoroughly, because she had spent 3 years trying to read him in insufficient light, making her best guesses and being told regularly that her guesses were wrong. In full afternoon light, with Leonard Graves standing between them, she read him with absolute clarity. He was afraid, not guilty, not remorseful, afraid, calculating, running the situation through a fast internal assessment. Exits and angles, costs and options. He said, "Maggie, can we speak privately?" She said, "No." One word, not angry, not trembling, just no. He said, "This is ridiculous. You're being dramatic." She said nothing. Leonard said, "Mr. Harlow, your attorney should be present for any further conversation. Here's a card with Mr. Keene's direct line." Preston took the card. He looked at it. He looked at Maggie, and here was the moment. This was the moment she would return to. Not because of the drama of it. There was no drama. It was quiet. That was exactly the point. He looked small, not evil, not the monster she had sometimes needed him to be in her imagination to justify the size of her fear. Just a man. A small, ordinary, frightened man who had found a woman he could diminish and had done so with great patience and skill, and was now facing the unremarkable consequence of that choice. She had imagined this moment many times. She had imagined fury. She had imagined tears. She felt neither. She felt something quiet and specific, something close to pity. She would not say so, but it was there. He left. The front door closed quietly, again. She thought, I thought the worst part would be watching him crumble. I thought I needed that. I needed to see him know that he'd lost. But he didn't crumble. He got smaller. He was always this size. I made him into something larger in my head because he needed me to. Because that was part of it. If I saw his actual size, I might not have stayed. It's not rage I feel. It's just sad. It's sad that I spent 3 years being afraid of something that was always that small. Leonard and Thomas worked through the evening. Diane stayed. She made sandwiches at some point and put one in front of Maggie and said nothing, and Maggie ate it. Carol called 4 times. Maggie answered the 4th call and explained carefully what was happening. Carol cried. She said, "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. I said to wait." Maggie said, "You didn't know, Mom. Neither did I. Not fully." Carol said, "What do you need?" Maggie said, "Right now I'm okay. Leonard and Thomas are here. Tomorrow I'll call you." Robert called at 8. His voice was warm and careful. There was an apology in it that hadn't yet been spoken, waiting for the right moment. Maggie said, "Dad, why were you ready? You said you'd been ready." He said, "About 18 months ago, a man who works in Preston's industry told me something concerning, that Preston was moving money into accounts he couldn't trace. I had my attorneys investigate. I've known for a while that something was wrong. I couldn't come to you. You weren't speaking to me, but I could prepare." She said, "He told me you were untrustworthy." He said, "I know." She said, "I believed him." He said, "I know that too. You don't have to apologize for it." She said, "I'm going to anyway." He said, "Then I'll listen. But not tonight. Tonight you need to rest." The following morning, Maggie saw Dr. Cole. Not a scheduled appointment. Leonard had quietly arranged it. The stress of the previous 48 hours needed monitoring at 34 weeks. Dr. Cole examined her. The baby was fine, blood pressure elevated, but not dangerous. Dr. Cole documented the bruising, photographs, official record, dated and signed. She looked at Maggie for a long moment. She said, "You came back." Maggie said, "You gave me a card." Dr. Cole said, "I give a lot of cards." Maggie said, "I kept it." Dr. Cole nodded. She wrote something. Then she said, "Rose is a good name." Maggie looked up. Dr. Cole said, "You said it out loud in the waiting room. Just to yourself. I don't think you noticed." Maggie laughed. A real laugh. Small and surprised, like something she hadn't been sure still worked. The first real laugh in longer than she could easily calculate. On the drive back from the appointment, she looked out the window, and the city looked slightly different. Like the resolution had shifted, like she'd been wearing the wrong prescription for years, and someone had quietly corrected it. The same streets, the same buildings, but clearer. She took out her phone and texted Diane. Just laughed for the first time in, I don't know how long. Diane replied immediately. "What was it?" Maggie typed. Dr. Cole heard me say Rose out loud. Without realizing, Diane typed, "That is the best thing. That is the absolute best thing. What's her middle name?" Maggie thought about it. She typed, "I don't know yet. Something she can grow into." Diane, exactly right. Maggie put her phone in her lap and watched the city go by and thought, there it is. There is the thing I forgot. I forgot what it felt like to be a person with thoughts that belong only to me. She was staying at her father's house. He lived 40 minutes from where she had been living. She had only seen the house twice before. It was large and spare in the way that a man who traveled often created a home, organized, uncluttered, functional. He had prepared the guest room carefully, fresh towels, a good bedside lamp, a novel on the nightstand. She recognized the novel immediately. She had mentioned it to him once, 3 years ago, in a brief phone call before the distance had grown. He had remembered. She appreciated this. She didn't say so yet. There were too many things between them to step over all at once. The gratitude was real. The complication was also real. Both could be true. The protection order had come through. Preston had been served. He was staying at the downtown apartment, the one Leonard had documented. 14 months of lease payments. Its own kind of evidence. She was safe, legally, medically, practically. She lay in the guest room at 2 a.m. and could not sleep. Who am I without all of that? Not just Preston, not just the marriage, the whole structure of it, the mansion, the role of wife of Preston Harlow, the social position that had come with his name and his family and his world, the sense of having arrived somewhere, of being part of something larger than herself. Even if where she had arrived was a cage, she had known the shape of it. She had known the rules. Now she was in a room with no rules and no shape yet, and the question bouncing off the walls at 2 a.m. was, without all of that, who are you? She was Margaret Whitfield, Maggie, the woman who had drawn a sparrow for a coffee shop and felt exactly right, who had stayed up too late reading and made impractical art and had opinions about things that didn't matter and laughed too loud at her own jokes and called her father before someone told her not to. That woman had not died. She had just gone very quiet, had learned to take up less space. She was 32 years old. She had a baby coming in 6 weeks. She had a father across the hall who was trying very hard. She had Diane, who had driven 4 hours and was asleep on the couch downstairs because she refused to leave yet. She had a sketchbook in her bag. She was going to be okay. She knew this with the part of her brain that processed facts. But right now, at 2 in the morning, she was at the bottom of something. And the bottom was quiet and dark, and the question had no answer yet. She noticed something, though. She was not afraid of the question, just at the bottom, just sitting with it. And bottoms, she thought. Bottoms have floors. Morning. Her father was a 6 a.m. person. She was not, but pregnancy had rearranged her schedule entirely, and she came downstairs at 6:15 to find him making coffee with the careful quietness of a man trying not to wake a sleeping house. He saw her. He paused. He said, "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep." He said, "Coffee? Oh, you probably shouldn't have," she said. "Decaf is fine." A pause. "You remembered I was pregnant," he said. "You're 8 months along, Maggie. You are very obviously pregnant." She said, "I mean, you remembered to think about it." He understood what she meant. He put the decaf on, and they sat at the kitchen island, and there was a long moment where both of them were deciding whether to begin at the beginning or somewhere in the middle. He began. He told her what he knew, not just the affair, the financial picture, the asset movement, the way Preston had systematically separated Maggie from her father from early in the marriage. He told her that when he had first encountered Preston at that charity dinner 2 years ago, something had not been right, that the awareness of it had grown, that he had had his attorneys watching the finances for 18 months. He told her he believed Preston had known, when he met Maggie, that her father had money and influence, that the relationship may have had calculation at its origin. She listened to all of it. She had known some of it. Knowing it as a whole was different from knowing it in pieces. She said, "I want to tell you something." He said, "Okay." She said, "I know that you and Mom had a real divorce, that there were actual things that happened, things I was told about and had my own feelings about. I don't want to pretend that Preston invented all of it. Some of my feelings about you were mine, and they were real, and I let him use them. But I also let him reshape things that didn't need reshaping. And I'm sorry for that." He was quiet. He nodded. He said, "That's fair. I did things that hurt you. That's not Preston's invention." She said, "So this isn't a clean story where the villain erased a perfect relationship. It's messier than that." He said, "Most real things are." She said, "I want to fix what can be fixed between us." He said, "So do I." They sat with that. The coffee brewed. Outside, the morning birds were starting. He poured 2 cups. He sat back down. He said, "She's going to be beautiful, your daughter." She said, "Rose." He said, "Rose Whitfield Harlow?" She said, "Just Rose Whitfield." He said, "Good." She sat by the window with her decaf and opened her sketchbook. The pen was in her hand again. She drew the sparrow. Not the one from 3 years ago, a different one. The same bird, but older, the wings wider, more confident of the air beneath them. Starting over is not failure, she thought. Starting over is what brave people do. The only people who never start over are the people who stopped moving. I have been still for 3 years. I'm going to be terrible at moving at first. I'm going to be clumsy and uncertain, and I'm going to make mistakes. I don't care. Rose is going to watch me try. That's enough. That's the whole point. Atek. Nathan Harlow called that afternoon. She almost didn't answer. She answered because she was tired of letting men she was afraid of go to voicemail. Nathan Harlow was 67 years old, the voice of a man who had never been seriously refused anything, who addressed all situations, including human beings in crisis, in the tone of a manager reviewing a performance concern. He said, "Margaret, I've been made aware of the situation. I'd like to speak with you before this goes further in the legal arena." She said, "Okay." He said, "My son has weaknesses. I'm not here to dispute that. But the Harlow name, the business, the extended family, there are many people who will be affected by what you're doing." She said, "I know." He said, "I'd like to discuss a settlement that manages this quietly." She said, "I don't want it managed quietly." He said, "Be reasonable, Margaret." She said, "I am being reasonable. My attorney will be in touch." She hung up. She sat, very still, for a moment. Then she called Thomas Keene and said, "Preston's father called me. He wants a quiet settlement." Thomas said, "What would you like me to do?" She said, "Don't settle quietly." Thomas said, "Understood." She hung up and sat with her hands in her lap and noticed her hands were not shaking. She had never noticed her hands when they were still. She had spent so long noticing them when they weren't. She found, in the closet of the guest room, her sketchbook from the garden, the one from the day she had found the photograph, the one she had opened and held the pen over and not yet drawn in. She opened it now. She filled 3 pages. No plan, no brief, no client, just shapes and lines and her hand moving because it wanted to. She stopped. She looked at what she had made. Something was beginning to form. Something she couldn't name yet, but recognized. She closed the book. She held it. There you are, she thought. 3 weeks later, Rose Whitfield was born. 11:51 in the morning. 7 pounds 2 ounces. In the maternity ward of the hospital, where Dr. Cole had been waiting since 6 a.m. She came out loud, not crying in the uncertain way of some newborns, declaring herself, insisting on being present, already completely sure of her right to take up space. Maggie held her. There were no words adequate for this. There were never words adequate for this. She just held her daughter, and the world rearranged itself around that fact. Robert Whitfield was in the waiting room. He had driven down the night before and slept badly in a hotel down the street and been at the hospital since 6. Diane had arrived at 5 because Diane had spent the morning drinking terrible vending machine coffee and sending Maggie encouraging texts from 20 feet away. They brought Rose out. Maggie watched her father hold his granddaughter for the first time. He was not a man who cried easily. His whole life he had been a man who kept his face composed, who processed things privately, who expressed love through action rather than demonstration. He cried, quietly, briefly. He turned his face slightly so Maggie wouldn't notice. She noticed. She thought, this is what was on the other side. This, specifically. Not the defeat of Preston, not the victory, just this room, this morning, this person. Preston did not come. He had known the due date. Thomas had communicated it through the appropriate channels. He sent, through his attorney, a document acknowledging paternity and requesting a visitation arrangement. Correct. Legal. Completely bloodless. Maggie read it in the hospital bed with Rose asleep on her chest, the warm, impossible weight of her daughter's head against her collarbone. She felt nothing about the document except mild administrative tiredness. She handed it to Thomas and said, "Deal with it." He did. The divorce proceedings took 4 months. The story did not linger on these months with drama, because real legal proceedings were mostly exhausting and procedural, and the justice in them was quiet and thorough rather than triumphant. The asset documentation was thorough. Leonard Graves and Thomas Keene had been building it for weeks, the downtown apartment, 14 months of payments, the offshore accounts that had been quietly filling over 18 months, the redirected investment income. Preston's attorney made several attempts to minimize. The documentation was too complete. Claire Novak's attorney reached out in the third week. Claire was willing to provide testimony. She had been told throughout the affair that Preston's marriage was effectively over, that Maggie knew, that the separation was imminent. She had been lied to with the same thoroughness and the same patience that Maggie had been lied to. Different lies, same liar. Maggie did not become Claire's friend, but she did not blame her. That distinction mattered. The anger that could have gone toward Claire went somewhere more accurate instead. Nathan Harlow withdrew his personal support from his son's legal position in the fifth week, quietly and completely, when the full picture of the financial irregularities emerged, some of which connected to the Harlow family business directly. Nathan's personal attorney was instructed to cooperate with discovery. Preston faced the proceedings without his father's backing. He turned out to be exactly as powerful as he had always actually been. Not very. The settlement was substantial, not because Maggie was vindictive, because the documentation was thorough, and the law was clear about hidden assets in a marriage, and the physical evidence of what had happened to her arm was in Dr. Cole's official record. She would sell the house. She had no desire to raise Rose in those rooms. She would receive a fair distribution of the marital assets, plus the hidden assets, now discoverable, plus child support established at an appropriate level. She was not wealthy. She was not struggling. She was standing on ground that was solid for the first time in 3 years. She stood in Thomas Keene's office after the final papers were signed, and she shook his hand, and she walked outside into a March afternoon that was cold and bright and smelled of mud and the very beginning of spring. She stood on the sidewalk. She turned her face up toward the light. Okay, she thought. Okay, here. Diane came for a long weekend when Rose was 6 weeks old. She arrived with a bag and immediately wanted to hold the baby, which she did, with the confidence of someone who was secretly a natural and would never say so. They sat in Robert's kitchen. Maggie was still staying with her father, while her apartment in Columbus was being set up, and Diane held Rose and said nothing for a while. Just held her. Then she said, "I need to say something, and I need you to not apologize when I'm done." Maggie said, "Okay." Diane said, "I never stopped checking on you. Texts, calls. When you stopped answering, I sent cards with no message, just my number, because I needed you to know there was always a door. I couldn't make you walk through it, but I never locked it." Maggie looked at her. Diane said, "I'm telling you this because I need you to know. You are not alone. Even when you felt completely alone, you were not." Maggie said, "I know. I think I kept you at a distance because part of me knew you'd tell me the truth. And I wasn't ready for the truth." Diane said, "That's very insightful." Maggie said, "Therapy." Diane said, "Oh, thank God. How long?" Maggie said, 6 weeks. "It's going well." Diane said quietly, "I have cried about this every single day waiting for you to say that." Rose made a small sound in Diane's arms. Diane looked down at her and said, "Yes, yes, I know. You're very important. I haven't forgotten about you." Maggie laughed again, the second real laugh. These were getting easier. In therapy, her therapist's name was Janet, early 50s, a plant on every surface, a voice that moved slowly and wasn't annoying about it. Janet asked her, "What do you think you learned from all of this?" Maggie thought for a long time. She said, I learned that love should not require you to become smaller. I knew that before I met Preston. I knew it theoretically, but there's a difference between knowing something and living it. I lived the opposite of it for 3 years, and now I know the difference in my body, not just my head. Janet said, "What else?" Maggie said, "I learned that the people who love you are not always the ones who are closest to you, and the ones closest to you are not always the ones who love you. Those two things can be different." Janet wrote something. She said, "What do you want now?" Maggie said, "I want to work again. I want to draw things. I want Rose to see me draw things and think it's just what her mother does. Normal. Just the ordinary thing her mother does." She paused. "I want to call my father more. I want to stop being embarrassed about what happened. I want to tell it plainly when people ask, not as a tragedy, not as something shameful, just as something that happened." She said, "I want a life that is mine, not an escape from someone else's, not a reaction to what I survived, something I built on purpose, that belongs to me." Janet looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "You've already started." 5 months after Rose was born, Maggie Whitfield had 4 clients. She had legally reclaimed her name 3 months before that. Margaret Whitfield, in the official documents. Maggie Whitfield, in practice, the name she had always been when she was herself. She was living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus, 10 minutes from her mother, 40 minutes from her father. Good morning light through the east-facing windows. A design table she had set up under the biggest window. Rose's room had hand-painted birds on one wall. Sparrows and wrens and one ambitious cardinal. That Maggie had painted herself on 4 Saturday afternoons with the radio on and Rose asleep in her bouncy seat nearby, watching through half-closed eyes. She was not perfectly happy. She was 32 years old with a 5-month-old baby and a freelance business she was building from the ground up. And some mornings were very hard and some nights were very long, and the loneliness arrived sometimes in the evenings like an uninvited guest. She had learned to let it arrive, to acknowledge it, to offer it a cup of tea, metaphorically, and sit with it for a while, and then let it leave. That was what Janet called processing. It turned out processing was mostly just not running away. The bookshop logo had been her first client. The owner was a woman named Beverly who was opening a small independent bookshop on the north side of Columbus. She had found Maggie through a friend of a friend. She had emailed with a document full of adjectives: warm, literary, welcoming, intelligent, a little eccentric. Maggie had spent 3 days sketching before she landed on it. An open book with a small figure sitting inside the pages, reading. Simple, warm, exactly right. Beverly had cried when she saw it. Maggie had thought of the sparrow, of the coffee shop in Bexley, of the owner who had cried and said that's exactly it. She had thought, I'm back. There it is. There I am. Beverly had told 2 people about Maggie. Both of them called. Maggie had taken both commissions. Then a third, through a different connection. Then a fourth, 4 clients. A website she had built herself, imperfect and honest. A portfolio page that was growing. She was working again. She was herself again in the specific way that work makes a person themselves. Not just a role, not just a function. A person with a skill and an eye and something particular to offer the world. Her father visited every 2 weeks. He and Maggie had not finished their conversations. Some of those conversations would take years. Some might not finish entirely. That was real, and she had made her peace with it being real. But he held Rose with the ease of someone learning something new in real time and discovering they were good at it. He arrived with very small, specific gifts. A wooden rattle, a soft book about birds, a small stuffed rabbit, that suggested he had thought about it rather than grabbed something convenient. One Sunday afternoon, they were sitting in Maggie's apartment. Rose was on a blanket on the floor between them, recently discovering that things hanging above her were interesting and could possibly be controlled if she moved her hands in the right way. She was entirely absorbed in this project. She had no interest in the adults. Robert said, "I'm proud of you." Maggie was scared, said. "For what specifically?" He said, "For calling me, for not waiting any longer than you did." She said, "I almost waited much longer." He said, "But you didn't." She said, "No." She looked at Rose. Rose batted at the mobile with great seriousness. Maggie said, "I think I stayed as long as I did because I believed that leaving meant failing. I believed if I was patient enough, understanding enough, worked hard enough at it, I could fix it. And it took me 3 years to understand that some things aren't broken. They were built wrong from the start. You can't fix something that was never right." Her father said nothing. He nodded. She said, "And I think I was afraid that if I left, I'd have nothing, that the nothing I feared was waiting for me on the other side. But the nothing was already inside the marriage. He had taken everything already. Leaving just let me see the space clearly, and then fill it with things that were actually mine." Her father looked at her for a long moment. He said, "When you were little, 7, 8 years old, you used to draw on every surface you could find. The backs of envelopes, paper bags, receipts. You would draw birds, mostly. I don't know why birds. You just drew birds everywhere." She said, "I remember." He said, "I kept some of them. I have a folder in my office. I never threw them away." She looked at him. He said, "I always knew you'd come back to yourself. I just had to wait." She had taken on a new client in the 3rd month, a woman named Cora who was launching a therapy practice for survivors of domestic abuse. She had found Maggie's website and emailed carefully, explaining the nature of the work, asking if Maggie would be comfortable with it. Maggie had replied, "Yes, this work is exactly the kind I want to do." The logo took 3 drafts to get right. The first draft was a figure in motion, rising. She looked at it and thought, "That's not it. That's how people imagine recovery looks, not how it actually feels." The second draft was a butterfly. She abandoned it before she finished sketching it. Too symbolic, too easy. The third draft came on a Wednesday night when Rose was asleep and the apartment was quiet, and Maggie was at her table with the lamp on and the radio low. She drew a figure that was simply standing, upright, feet on the ground, not running, not transforming, not performing victory, just standing and taking up exactly the space she occupied. She looked at it for a long time. "That's it," she thought. "That's what it actually is. Not triumph, just presence, just the fact of being here and taking up space and not apologizing for it." Cora cried when she saw it. She said, "That's exactly it." "How did you know?" Maggie thought about the answer for a moment. She said, "I've been practicing standing." The design conference was on a Thursday in October. Not a large one. A regional networking event held at a hotel in downtown Columbus. She had been meaning to start attending these, getting back into professional circles. Showing up, she had almost not come. She had an excuse ready, Rose's schedule, a deadline, a dozen practical reasons that were also just fear. Diane had called the night before and said, "Are you going to that conference tomorrow?" Maggie had started to say the excuse about Rose's schedule. Diane had said, "I'm asking because you should go." Maggie had gone. The conference was ordinary in the way that these events were ordinary. Name tags, bad coffee, panels she partially disagreed with, which was a good sign. She was forming opinions again. She was thinking critically again. She was present in a room without monitoring herself for every reaction. She was at the coffee station at around 2 in the afternoon. She was pouring herself something and thinking about a presentation she had heard that had made a claim she didn't fully accept, and she was constructing her disagreement, organizing her thinking, being a person with a professional opinion. She looked up. Preston was across the room. He was with two men she didn't recognize. He was in a dark suit. He was laughing at something one of them had said. He looked the same height, the same posture, the same ease in a room full of professionals. He looked the same, and she felt nothing. Not the anticipatory dread she had imagined she would feel, not the rage she had thought was waiting for her, not even the cold, specific pity she had felt the night Leonard Graves opened the door and Preston had rung his own doorbell. Just nothing. The nothing of a thing that was over, completely over. All the space it had taken up inside her, all the fear and the calculation and the hope and the grief, gone. Resolved into something she recognized as wholeness. Her own space, her own again. He saw her. The laugh stopped. He looked at her for 3 seconds. She counted them. She looked back. She nodded. Once. Small. Not forgiveness. She had decided some time ago that forgiveness was not the goal, that it was not something she owed him, that what she owed herself was not forgiveness, but completion. This was the nod of completion. I see you. I'm past you. I am entirely past you. He nodded back, compressed. A small, careful movement. She turned back to the coffee station. She finished pouring. She went back into the main room. She called Diane from the parking lot. It was late afternoon by then. The sky was the specific October blue that she had always loved. Deep and clean and suggesting something. Diane answered immediately. She said, "How was it?" Maggie said, "I saw Preston." Diane was very quiet for 2 seconds. She said, "And?" Maggie said, "And nothing. Truly nothing. He was just a person across the room." Diane said, "Maggie." Maggie said, "I know." Diane said, "Are you okay?" Maggie said, "I'm better than okay. I'm a regular okay. Just regular. And I cannot tell you how much better regular okay is than where I was." Diane laughed. Maggie laughed. 2 women laughing on the phone on a Thursday afternoon in October. Nothing extraordinary about it. Everything extraordinary about it. She designed 3 more logos that fall. A bakery run by 2 sisters who argued constantly and made extraordinary bread. A small veterinary clinic with a particular specialty in old dogs. A consulting firm whose owner had built everything herself from a very small beginning. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. She had known it. Some part of her had always known it. And she had spent 3 years in a house where knowing things was slowly made dangerous. Now she sat at her table by the window with Rose nearby, usually in her bouncy seat or on her playmat. And she drew things, and Rose watched her, and it was exactly as ordinary and as important as Maggie had imagined it would be. This is what I wanted, she thought, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, looking up from her work to find Rose watching her with the profound, uncritical attention of a 6-month-old who found everything her mother did interesting. This is exactly what I wanted. In December, Carol came for the weekend. She had been before, several times, but this visit was different. Easier. They were past the initial careful tenderness of the aftermath. They were finding their way back to the ordinary textures of being mother and daughter. Carol held Rose for most of the visit. She sat in Maggie's kitchen and held her granddaughter and watched Maggie move around the apartment with an expression that took Maggie a while to identify. Relief. It was relief. On the second morning, over coffee, Carol said, "I need to say something." Maggie said, "Okay." Carol said, "When you called me and told me what was happening, when I told you to wait, I have thought about that conversation every day since. I didn't understand the size of what I was saying. I thought I was being practical, and I was being harmful, and I am so sorry." Maggie said, "Mom." Carol said, "I need to say it." Maggie said, "I know you do. I'm listening." Carol said, "I was raised to believe that you worked harder, that if something was wrong in a marriage, you found a way through it, that leaving was failure, and I gave you that belief without the context for when it was wrong. That's on me." Maggie said, "It's on the people who gave it to you, too." Carol said, "Maybe, but you're my daughter, and I should have known better." Maggie looked at her mother, at the lines around her eyes, the gray coming into her hair, the way she held Rose with total confidence, the way her hands were the same hands that had held Maggie exactly this way 32 years ago. She said, "You know better now," Carol said. "Yes," Maggie said, "that's what counts." Stone Minarchuk. She went back to Janet in January, not because things were bad, because she had something she wanted to say out loud. She sat in the chair with the plant on the shelf behind it, and she said, "I figured something out." Janet said, "Tell me." Maggie said, "I used to think that what he did to me was the main thing. The betrayal, the abuse, the control. I thought that was the story, and it is part of the story. But the other part of the story, the part I'm more interested in now, is what I found out about myself." Janet said, "What did you find out?" Maggie said, "That I'm stronger than I knew. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a I survived something heroic way. Just, I went through something very hard, and I am still here, and I am working, and I have my daughter, and I have people who love me, and I have a sketchbook full of drawings, and I am okay. I am actually, genuinely, specifically okay." She paused. "And I think the reason I couldn't see it before, the reason I stayed when I should have left, is that I had stopped believing I deserved okay. He was very good at making me feel like okay was more than I should expect, and I believed him." Janet said, "And now?" Maggie said, "Now I know okay is the minimum. Okay is where you start from, not where you aim." The prison door was open the whole time, she thought, on an ordinary Thursday morning in February, sitting at her table, with her coffee cooling beside her and Rose asleep in the next room, and the morning light coming through the east windows the way it always did. I was the one holding it shut, not because I was weak, because I had been taught very carefully, over a very long time, that the outside of the door was more frightening than the inside. That was the lie. That was the whole lie. I'm not angry at myself for believing it. I know now how those beliefs get built. I know the patience and the skill it takes to build them. I know that it happened to me, and it has happened to many women, and it will happen again, and the answer is not to be smarter or more suspicious, but to build a world where the lie is harder to tell. I have a daughter. She is going to grow up watching me draw birds at a table by a window. She's going to grow up knowing that her mother worked and had opinions and laughed too loudly at her own jokes and called her father on Sundays, and had a best friend who drove 4 hours with brownies because she couldn't sleep. She is going to know what it looks like when a woman takes up exactly the space she is supposed to take up. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything. Spring came. Rose was 8 months old and had recently discovered that she could pull herself up by holding on to things, which she found enormously satisfying and practiced constantly, usually at an hour when Maggie would have preferred to be sleeping. It was a Tuesday morning, not dramatically, just a Tuesday, the same way everything important began. In the middle of an ordinary week, in a kitchen with good morning light, with coffee brewing, and a baby on the floor, and a sketchbook open on the table. Maggie was drawing, not for a client this morning, for herself. She had gotten in the habit of drawing for herself before the workday started. Just 20 minutes. Whatever wanted to come out. This morning, she was drawing the apartment, the window, the light, the specific way the morning came in, at this angle, in April, and made everything look like something she wanted to remember. Rose was on her playmat, pulling herself up by the edge of the coffee table. She got up, balanced for 3 full seconds, looked at Maggie with complete triumph, and sat back down. Then she did it again. Maggie watched her. She thought about the version of herself that had stood in a hallway at 11:43 at night with a glass of water she hadn't touched, listening to a laugh through a closed door. That woman had not been stupid or weak or compliant. She had been a person inside a system that was designed to keep her in place, and she had trusted the wrong person with the construction of her reality, and she had found her way out. She thought about Dr. Cole sliding a card across a desk. She thought about Diane answering on the second ring. She thought about 4 black SUVs in a driveway on a Thursday afternoon, and a man named Leonard Graves stepping out of the first one with a briefcase and a calm face and the information that her father had been ready for 2 years. She thought about her father's voice on the phone. "Tell me where you are." She thought about the sparrow she had drawn for the coffee shop in Bexley, the sparrow she had drawn in her father's guest room, the birds on Rose's wall, the figure standing in Cora's logo, just standing, taking up space. She thought about Preston across a conference room. 3 seconds, a nod, nothing. She picked up her pen. Rose pulled herself up again, balanced for 4 seconds this time, and looked at Maggie with an expression of absolute confidence. Like of course she could do this. Like she had always known she could do this. Like standing up was simply the next thing, and she was doing it. Yes, Maggie thought, exactly like that. She drew. Outside the east-facing windows, Columbus was waking up. A bus went by. Somewhere up the street, someone was walking a dog. The sky was the specific April blue that she had always loved, new and clean, and suggesting that things were possible. Her coffee was going cold. She didn't reach for it yet. She drew. She drew the window and the light and the morning and the baby on the floor and the ordinary particular beauty of a Tuesday in April in a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio, where a woman with a sketchbook and 4 clients and a daughter named Rose was doing the most important thing. She was just here. She was just this, alive and working, and exactly where she was supposed to be. The coffee went cold. She didn't mind. She drew.
So that's Maggie's story. But if you stayed until the end, I think part of you recognized something in it. Maybe a detail, maybe a feeling, maybe just the particular exhaustion of a woman who spent years telling herself small lies to keep the peace. Let me leave you with what I believe this story is really about. It's not about the betrayal. Betrayal is loud. Betrayal is the thing everyone talks about. The photograph, the other woman, the lie. And yes, those things happened. They hurt. They changed everything. But the real story, the story underneath the story, is about what happens when you are slowly, patiently, systematically taught not to trust yourself. That is what abuse actually looks like most of the time. Not the dramatic blow, the quiet erosion, the gentle corrections, the 1,000 small moments where your instincts were right and you were told they weren't, until one day you reach for your own judgment and it isn't where you left it. If you have ever been in a relationship, romantic, professional, family, where you consistently left conversations feeling like the problem was you, where your emotions were regularly treated as symptoms rather than signals, where you found yourself apologizing for noticing things, please hear this. Your instincts are not the problem. Your instincts are the earliest protection you have. The work is learning to trust them again. It's not about finding someone better. Maggie's story does not end with a new love interest. It doesn't end with a dramatic revenge. It ends with a woman at a table by a window, drawing birds, with her daughter on the floor nearby. That is the ending on purpose, because the culture we live in often tells women that recovery means replacement, that healing means finding someone new who will value you correctly, that the proof you're okay is a new relationship. But Maggie's proof of being okay was a sketchbook. 4 clients, a laugh she didn't expect, a daughter named Rose whose middle name she hadn't decided yet because she was taking her time and that was allowed. Recovery looks like reclaiming the ordinary things, the things you were quietly asked to put down along the way, the work you loved, the friend you stopped calling, the parent you were told was the problem, the name you were born with. The proof of healing is not who loves you next. It's who you become when you stop performing for anyone. It's not about whether you should stay or leave. This story does not tell you what to do with your own life. It doesn't know your circumstances. It doesn't know your financial situation, your children, your history, your heart. What it does know is this: no one should be ashamed of how long they stayed. Leaving is not simple. Leaving requires resources, practical, financial, emotional, social, that abusers systematically work to remove. The fact that it takes time is not weakness. The fact that it takes a phone call at 2 a.m. and 4 SUVs and a father who was ready for 2 years, that's not failure. That's how hard it actually is. And if you are somewhere right now that feels like Maggie's hallway at 11:43, standing in the dark, holding a glass of water you haven't touched, listening to something that doesn't feel right, let me say to you what no one said to Maggie soon enough. You are not imagining it. Your instincts are telling you something true, and there is a door. You don't have to know what's on the other side. You don't have to have a plan. You just have to call someone. Anyone. A Diane, a Robert, a Dr. Cole with a card. Someone who will say, "Tell me everything." What Maggie found on the other side of that door was not a perfect life. It was a real one. A life with hard mornings and freelance anxiety, and a baby who didn't sleep through the night and conversations with her father that would take years to finish. But it was hers. That is what this story is about. Not triumph, not revenge, not the arrival at some perfect destination. Just a woman reclaiming her own life, one small thing at a time. The sketchbook, the sparrow, the name Rose, the table by the window and the morning light, and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of being exactly where you are supposed to be. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. You might not know who that is, but you might. Take care of yourselves, and trust the voice inside you that says, something is not right. It usually knows. Closing note. This content was manually researched, developed, and edited by our team with the intention of bringing meaning, healing, and real-life lessons to every listener. Every story we tell is built with care, not generated, not rushed, not made to fill a feed. It is made to matter. Thank you for being part of this community.